A Global History of Architecture, Striving Towards the Ideal Architectural History Book. A Global History of Architecture by Francis D.K. Ching, Mark Jarzombek, and Vikramaditya Prakash is a history textbook focused on presenting a more diverse history of architecture throughout the world. It was originally published in 1995 and has been updated twice since then. Jarzombek is a professor at MIT, and both Ching and Prakash are professors at the University of Washington. Ching is also a skilled artist and has made the illustrations in the book. The textbook is divided into 18 loose sections called time cuts in order to demonstrate the connectivity between architecture throughout the world during certain time periods. Each section includes a summary of a historical context at the beginning, a map, timeline, and discussions of individual buildings. A Global History of Architecture leaves out important issues in architectural history. For example, female figures in architecture and historical preservation, and only provides a shallower look for the case on modernism. However, because it includes a more diverse representation and focuses on connecting events that are happening simultaneously in different parts of the world, it's a good option for classroom use. The authors aspired to represent the history of the whole world in this book. They worked towards the goal of increased diversity by dedicating a majority of the book's content to non-Western architecture, unlike many other textbooks on the subject. During each period, the authors discussed non-Western architecture and its influence as much as, if not more than, Western architecture. The organization of each time cut also reflects the desire to represent different locations of architecture equally, rather than maintaining the same order every chapter by beginning with the West and moving towards the East or vice versa. Each time cut is arranged according to its own logic. This serves to remind readers that work does not begin with the East or West, and the study of its history can start anywhere. Another goal of the authors was to represent architectural history as a series of interconnected events around the globe. The division of the book into these time cuts allowed them to frame contemporaneous developments throughout the globe so that readers can easily see the similarities and differences between regions and cultures. Through this organization, students are able to develop a global perspective on architectural history, which allows them to connect significant architecture and events globally. This is the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation building at the Bund, Shanghai. It can be found on page 700 in the Global History of Architecture. In its 220-word description, the author dedicated 123 to the context information, how Shanghai evolved from a small fisherman town to the Paris of the East within 100 years due to the Opium War. In this way, the book explains why this building exists rather than just introducing the architecture features. Also on the same page, which demonstrates colonial architecture in Asia, examples from Japan, Korea are mentioned, so that readers can get an idea of what's happening elsewhere around the world at that age. And this is a typical way of a global history of architecture presents information by time cuts.
The time cut organization of a global history of architecture is an innovative approach to the discussion of architectural history. While it allows students to better understand the interconnectivity of architecture around the world, there are some drawbacks to this organization. John Stubbs, a professor at preservation practice at Columbia University at the time he reviewed the book, argues that dividing architectural history into different areas can cause confusion. It can result in the comparison of works that were built in the same era but have little in common. It is also difficult for students to use as a reference if they want to know the continuous history of a single country or area. This raises the question of how architectural history should be taught. Should it be by country or by time period? The answer to this question can determine whether the time cut organization is successful or not. But in terms of achieving the author's goal of emphasizing the connection between architecture across the globe, this division is effective. A global history of architecture is a good option to have in the classroom as many of its features set it apart from other textbooks. The illustrations of Ching are necessary to the narrative of the book and present the buildings in a way that cannot be done through photographs alone. Its diverse nature and strong representation of non-Western architecture make it a better option for students than older books. For example, History of Architecture by Bannister Fletcher. This book, although one of the earliest introductions of non-Western architecture into a historical book, depicts other cultures as other and lesser. A Global History of Architecture, in contrast, strives to depict all cultures as equal in importance. In comparison to World Architecture, a cross-cultural history by Richard Ingersoll, A Global History of Architecture contains more plans, clear illustrations, and a better layout. According to Andrew Ballantyne, professor of architecture at Newcastle University, World Architecture relies heavily on photographs, making the subject more like art history than architectural history. It also tends to inform stylistic discussions rather than giving information that would allow readers to imagine how the building was used. Another global history book that covers the same subject is Architecture, A Visual History by Jonathan Glancy. Both this book and A Global History of Architecture are largely dependent upon images and divide history into different time periods. However, A Global History of Architecture is more comprehensive in its coverage of examples and contexts. Roughly 70% of the layout of a visual history is made up of images, making it more like a popular book for non-professionals rather than a textbook for architecture students.
A Global History of Architecture perfectly responded to the NAAP's new requirements for all accredited architectural programs in the student performance criteria. They raised the standard of comprehension of non-Western architecture to a level comparable to that of Western architecture traditions. Historians are happy seeing this change, but also worried that there was not a textbook that accomplished the goal of teaching students non-Western architecture as much as Western architecture. At that time, this textbook was published, which appropriately recognizes the accomplishments of many different cultures. While a global history of architecture has many effective features, there are some components that could be improved upon. Diane Garado, a professor of architecture at the University of Southern California, criticized it for missing the opportunity to address gender issues in architectural history. The absence of many architects in a global history of architecture is a major drawback of using this book. The exclusion of women from mainstream architectural history is an issue that continues to exist, and this book missed the opportunity to work towards changing that. While a global history of architecture is a good option to use in the classroom due to its diversity and unique approach to organization, it is not perfect. Well, what makes an ideal architectural history textbook? Well, it must have adequate content on non-Western architectural history as a narrative is developing simultaneously around the world. It must provide historical context on the buildings included in the book, rather than merely describing the features of them. It must have a reasonable division or arrangements of time periods, but the best way to do this remains unknown. It must address historical issues, for example, the underrepresentation of female figures in architecture, which A Global History of Architecture failed to do. It must have a pleasant layout and drawings that help students to better understand the text and create a more imaginative experience.
Overall, A Global History of Architecture is an important and influential textbook because it incorporates a more global view of architecture than is represented in many other books, and organizes content in a way that emphasizes the interconnectivity of architecture across different cultures. Even though it does not contain enough information on certain subjects, like female architects, it is ultimately a good textbook to give students a global understanding of architectural history.